It was June 3rd, 1915. The summer was hot. I had just arrived at the seaport in New York and was looking around. The air was filled with the smell of the sea and engine oil. The horns of ships blended with the cries of seagulls, creating a unique melody of the port city. On the pier stood a giant icebreaker, almost 500 feet long, made of sturdy steel. Its hull structure was carefully designed to overcome ice barriers. With a wide, rounded bow, it was capable of efficiently breaking through ice, thereby reducing the likelihood of getting stuck. In the middle of the ship rose a powerful steam engine chimney, emitting thick smoke. Proudly displayed on the freshly painted hull was the name Resolute. Sailors and dock workers were hoisting crates of provisions, research equipment, and heavy bags of coal onto the icebreaker, which would provide energy for the ship in the cold waters of the Arctic. Suddenly, barking was heard from a distance. One of the men, holding a long leash, led a group of dogs. These animals were meant to help us navigate through the icy expanses. Soon, a man approached me and introduced himself as the assistant to the captain. His name was Lieutenant Edward Smith. He took my luggage and led me aboard the ship. On the deck, amidst the bustling sailors, I met a group of people who were conversing about something. Among them, I saw a familiar face. It was the expedition leader, Mr. Edmund Hale. He was a geologist and polar explorer specializing in the study of Arctic landscapes and climate. When he saw me, he waved and beckoned me over. As I approached, he introduced me to the people standing with him. It was Captain Edward Moreau, photographer and cinematographer Michael Thompson. I also introduced myself. My name was Henry Clark, and I was to work as the doctor on the upcoming expedition. After introductions, we discussed what we would encounter on our journey and the tasks ahead of us. The goal of the expedition was to conduct comprehensive scientific research of Arctic territories, mapping uncharted lands, studying flora and fauna, collecting meteorological data, and examining the geological structure of the region. Another important task was to search for the Northwest Passage, a sea route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific through Arctic waters, which held significant economic value. After a brief conversation, I was escorted to my spacious cabin. Settling in, I heard a signal indicating that we would soon set sail. I hurried out onto the deck where a roll call was being conducted. The ship's crew consisted of 150 people. They lined up on the deck while the captain walked among them, delivering a speech. Suddenly, a dull thud was heard, and everyone turned their heads to see one of the dock workers dropping a barrel of oil, which opened and started spilling oil onto the deck. The faces of all the sailors darkened. I asked a nearby sailor what had happened, and he said that it was a bad omen, indicating that the ship would face difficulties or disasters. I didn't believe in omens, but the sailors took them seriously. Several sailors quickly rushed to the scene to help mitigate the consequences. The captain, noticing what was happening, cleared his throat and adjusted his hat before firmly and confidently stating that he relied on the strength of the ship and the bravery of his crew, believing that the upcoming voyage would proceed without incident. Nevertheless, the incident with the oil barrel left its mark on the crew's mood. They moved around the ship with clouded expressions, filled with worry and anxiety. But the time came, and the Resolute slowly departed from the dock. The port became smaller and smaller in the distance until it finally disappeared from view. 3 days later, we reached our first stop, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. There we stopped for refueling and equipment checks before continuing our journey northward. The crew also used this time to conduct minor research on ocean currents and meteorological conditions in the North Atlantic. As the doctor aboard the Resolute, I took on the responsibility for the health and well-being of the crew. As we made our way through the Labrador Sea, I regularly conducted medical examinations of the crew members. To my relief, at that time, no one complained about their health condition. The next day, we set sail again, and our next stop was Nuuk, Greenland. We were supposed to reach there in 5 days. The vast waters of the sea, painted in deep blue, stretched out before us, like an endless path to undiscovered secrets. The horizon merged with the sky, creating an illusion of infinity, while the gentle sea breeze filled the air with the salty aroma of freedom. I had plenty of free time, and besides interacting with my companions, I spent time with the dogs. They were housed in special boxes on the open deck. These shelters provided protection for the dogs from harsh weather conditions such as strong winds and frost, while also allowing them enough space for movement and rest. They were Siberian Huskies, and their joyful barks and excited behavior upon seeing me always lifted my spirits. I took care of them, brushing their thick fur to keep it clean and free from matting, and checking their paws for minor cuts or cracks that could cause them pain in cold conditions. Among all the dogs on the deck, one individual particularly caught my attention. It was the pack leader, who stood out from the rest with his unusual appearance and charisma. Upon closer inspection, I realized that it wasn't a husky or malamute, but a real wolf. Intrigued by this unusual sight, I turned to Will, the dog handler, for explanations. Will shared with me an incredible story. The wolf's name was Storm. It turned out that he had found him in the forest when he was still a little cub. Contrary to expectations, the cub showed no aggression and easily responded to training. Deciding to experiment, Will included the wolf in the sled dog team to see how he would perform. To his surprise, the wolf not only adapted well to his new role, but quickly took up the position of the leader, demonstrating rare leadership qualities and the ability to inspire and guide the other dogs. At first, he wouldn't let me come close, but soon he got used to me and became my favorite. So, 5 days flew by and we reached Greenland. Approaching the island, we were stunned by the beauty of this remote corner of the world. Nuuk welcomed us with its colorful houses scattered across rocky hills, which appeared as tiny patches of color against the backdrop of majestic, snow-capped peaks towering behind the city. The port of the city was a lively place, where locals and visitors mingled, going about their daily business. Sailors unloaded goods and equipment, while Inuit people, dressed in traditional leather garments, offered their handmade crafts and smiled at us in greeting. Soon, an event occurred, which sailors spoke of as a sign of impending disasters, foretold at the beginning of our journey. One evening, when the crew of the Resolute and the explorers gathered at one of the local establishments to exchange stories with sailors from other ships and local residents, a tragedy occurred. Our most experienced navigator, Mr. Andrews, did not return to the ship after this gathering. He was last seen walking out onto the street to get some fresh air. Search efforts began immediately. Throughout the night, the team, led by the captain and local volunteers, combed the port, adjacent streets, and coastline, hoping to find Andrews, or at least some trace indicating his whereabouts. Despite all efforts, Mr. Andrews remained missing. The next day, expanding the search radius, one of the groups found him unconscious at the foot of a steep slope leading to the sea, where he apparently slipped and fell, sustaining a head injury. Emergency medical assistance was provided, and Andrews was brought back to the ship, where his condition stabilized. Fortunately, the injury turned out to be minor, and after a brief delay of 1 day, we continued our voyage, leaving the island. However, rumors began to spread among the crew that our expedition was supposedly cursed, causing agitation and some panic among the sailors. The potential loss of the navigator could have jeopardized the entire enterprise, creating significant difficulties for all of us. In light of these events, the captain had to intervene and take measures against those spreading alarming rumors. His decisive actions and penalties for the disturbers of peace helped restore order and discipline among the crew. After this incident, the atmosphere on board significantly improved, and everything seemed to have returned to normal. After all the trials and tribulations in Nuuk, our ship, the Resolute, finally set sail into the open sea, heading north towards the snow-covered shores of the Svalbard archipelago. Navigating towards these remote and poorly explored territories required maximum concentration and skill from the entire crew. We traversed the cold and stormy waters of the Arctic Ocean, encountering large icebergs and extensive fields of drifting ice. Day after day, despite the short polar nights, we continued our journey, facing harsh Arctic winds and ocean currents that tested our resilience and determination. As we approached Svalbard, the marine landscape became increasingly captivating. Glittering glaciers towering majestically over the sea began to appear on the horizon. Polar bears could occasionally be spotted on ice floes, while seabirds accompanied us on our journey, creating the sensation that we were truly approaching the edge of the Earth. Arriving at the Svalbard archipelago marked the final stop of our journey, where we could conduct research on Arctic flora and fauna and study the impact of the Arctic climate on local ecosystems. It was also the last opportunity to replenish supplies before continuing our journey into the heart of the Arctic. We entered one of its protected fjords, where the water was as calm as a mirror, reflecting the majestic snow-capped peaks and impregnable glaciers. This world seemed untouched by time, presenting pristine beauty and the might of nature. Soon we arrived at the port in Longyearbyen. It was simple and functional, without modern amenities. Wooden docks for receiving small ships and boats, warehouses for coal, fish, and whale blubber, as well as several buildings for housing and equipment storage for research expeditions. The port infrastructure served the basic needs of arriving vessels and was an important supply point for anyone daring to explore or work in this harsh Arctic region. We decided to make a 3-day stop here to replenish supplies and conduct necessary research. Fortunately, no unforeseen events occurred, except for one detail. At night, the dogs started howling, causing confusion for their caretaker. I noticed that the initiator of this howling was the wolf storm, followed by the other dogs. These nocturnal concerts caused alarm among the superstitious sailors on board. Such a nervous atmosphere persisted for all 3 days, and on the day of our departure, another event occurred, adding fuel to the fire of superstition. As soon as the ship began to depart from the pier, our eyes involuntarily fell on the priest standing on the shore. One of the sailors couldn't contain his emotions and loudly pointed him out. Instantly, whispers and muttering spread among the crew. I learned that seeing a priest before departure is considered the worst omen among sailors. Looking back at the receding shore, it couldn't help but feel that all signs were indicating to us the need to abandon further sailing. But despite the accumulating omens, our expedition continued its journey into uncharted waters. After our departure from Svalbard, the Resolute expedition headed towards one of the most mesmerizing and unexplored parts of our planet, the North Pole. Navigating through ice fields and open waters of the Arctic Ocean, our ship faced numerous challenges. Vast ice floes, shifting and changing shape under the influence of winds and currents, constantly forced us to adjust our course, seeking safe passages through frozen expanses. Navigation in such conditions required maximum concentration and professionalism from the team. Days and nights merged into one under the white glow of the polar day, when the sun barely touched the horizon creating an uninterrupted bright midday twilight. Polar bears, gracefully moving across the ice in search of food, seals peeking out from under the ice, and herds of walruses resting on the edge of icebergs reminded us that life stubbornly clings to existence even in the harshest conditions. Each day brought new scientific data. We studied the composition of seawater, took depth measurements, and mapped previously unknown sections of the seabed, contributing to the development of Arctic research. As soon as the Resolute ventured into the heart of the frozen waters of the Arctic, we encountered a fate about which many sailors had spun dark legends. Surrounded by endless ice, we found that our path forward was completely blocked by powerful ice fields. The ship was trapped in an ice prison, firmly gripped in the cold embrace of the Arctic. Time seemed to stand still, and with each passing hour, the ice tightened its steel claws around our vessel. The first order of business was a meeting of the crew to discuss the plan of action. Breaking free from the ice trap was not simple. It required concerted efforts from every member of the crew and the use of all available resources. The captain issued orders. Part of the crew had to start chopping ice around the ship, attempting to create a channel to exit into open water, while others worked on maintaining the functionality of the ship's engine and life support systems in extreme cold conditions. We used everything that could help in our struggle for freedom, from heavy ice axes and saws to explosives for controlled explosions aimed at weakening the ice encasement. While the team worked diligently to free the ship from the ice trap, Lieutenant Smith and photographer Michael Thompson decided to conduct reconnaissance of the surroundings on dog sleds. Setting off at dawn, they promised to return by lunchtime. However, time passed, and there was no news or trace of them. The expedition leader, Professor Hale, consumed by worry, paced the deck back and forth, while the captain tried to reassure him, suggesting waiting a little longer before sending a search party. Tension reached its peak, and the professor was about to organize a search party when suddenly a cry rang out in the air. One of the sailors pointed excitedly towards the horizon, where two dog sleds were slowly approaching the ship. These were our missing explorers. As they drew closer, it became evident that the trials they had faced had taken their toll. Lieutenant Smith and Michael Thompson looked exhausted to the limit, and exhaustion was evident in their eyes. The dogs, in turn, seemed frightened, and could barely muster the strength to climb aboard the ship. Once they had recovered from their ordeal, they gathered the crew of the Resolute around them to share the story of their unexpected adventure. Gathered in tense silence, the explorers recounted their reconnaissance. We followed the planned route when we noticed something that seemed absurd in these endless snowy expanses: a black spot. This spot on the white background caught our attention, and we decided to change course to investigate it further, began Lieutenant Smith. As they approached closer, they discovered that the mysterious black spot was actually a ship, the outlines of which resembled vessels from the 19th century, stranded in the ice and surrounded by a snowy desert. Michael Thompson added, "It was like a frozen-in-time vision. The ship seemed to have just stopped and was waiting to be rediscovered. But as we approached even closer, our dogs suddenly panicked." The dogs, who had faithfully followed the sleds until that moment, suddenly went berserk, starting to bark furiously and, despite all attempts to restrain them, tore away, dragging the sleds into the depths of the white wasteland. Attempts to calm them down were in vain. "We raced through the snow, losing all control," continued the lieutenant. With difficulty, they managed to regain control over the sleds and eventually make their way back to the Resolute. Their return was filled with relief, but also with new questions about what could have caused such a reaction in the dogs and what mysteries the found ship held. Lieutenant Smith's and Michael Thompson's story about the mysterious ship stuck in the ice stirred strong excitement and intrigue among everyone aboard the Resolute. The decision to organize a second expedition to the location of the frozen ship was made the next day. I eagerly volunteered to join the group of explorers. We prepared the necessary equipment, assembled the sleds, and set out in the morning armed with maps and compasses. While we headed towards the location of the ship, the remaining part of the crew continued to work on freeing the Resolute from the ice trap. The work with ice axes and saws never ceased for a moment. Navigating through snowdrifts and ice fields, we followed our sleds, which were struggling through the Arctic wilderness. As the contours of the ship began to appear on the horizon, our dogs suddenly began to show signs of distress. Their nervous behavior was so unusual that we decided to stop at a safe distance from the discovered vessel, leaving the dogs under the watchful eye of the handler. From that moment on, we continued on foot, feeling how each step brought us closer to something uncharted and possibly dangerous. Pushing through dense snow, we found ourselves at the foot of a giant. It was a 19th-century Dutch frigate. It loomed before us like a ghost from the past, shrouded in the mystical aura of Arctic legends. The first thing that caught our eye was its mighty weathered hull, colored by time in deep dark shades, with traces of white paint here and there, reminiscent of its former grandeur and power. The ship seemed frozen in time, its wooden surfaces covered with a layer of hoarfrost, giving it a ghostly appearance. The frigate's masts were broken and lay in disarray on its deck and around on the ice, and what remained of the sails hung in tatters on the ropes, swaying rhythmically under the Arctic winds. Once snowy white, these sails were now torn and stained, as if bearing witness to countless storms endured by the ship. The ship's deck was covered with a layer of snow and ice, creating the impression that no one had set foot on it for many years. Around the deck lay scattered maritime ropes, fragments of wood, and other items once necessary for the work and life of sailors. Despite its damages, the frigate still retained the outlines of a proud vessel that carried its passengers and cargo through the raging waters of the oceans. The atmosphere was filled with heavy silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind, which seemed like a barely audible moan of lost souls. As we approached closer, we began to feel an inexplicable unease, as if invisible eyes were watching us from behind the ship's warped hulls. We circled the frigate, trying to find any way aboard or inside to explore it and learn more about its past. Each step felt heavy, and there was a palpable sense of threat in the air. Professor Hale warned us to be cautious, as a bear could be hiding, which might have caused the dog's nervousness. Boarding the ship, our gaze fell on the door leading into the depths of the ship. Attempting to open it in the usual way proved futile. The door was frozen solid to the frame. Then, taking a run-up, Michael, with a powerful shoulder blow, broke it down, disrupting the prevailing dead silence. This abrupt sound echoed through the deserted expanses of the ship, as if awakening it from a centuries-old slumber. We lit a gas lantern, and its flickering light illuminated the path downwards into the corridor, along which doors to the cabins were located. Descending the stairs, we felt the air getting colder with each step, and each breath filled our lungs with piercing coldness. The first door we opened led to a living cabin, where a skeleton lay on the bed in eternal repose. The scene seemed both peaceful and unsettling. It seemed as if the person had fallen asleep and never woke up, frozen in sleep for centuries. We continued to inspect the cabins, and in each of them we were greeted with similar scenes. Skeletons of the crew, frozen in different poses of everyday life, as if death had suddenly overtaken them. The frozen skeleton still retained black remnants of flesh, chillingly well preserved in Arctic conditions. Continuing our exploration, we noticed that the interior of the cabin seemed imbued with the spirit of the past. From the personal belongings of the sailors to maps and navigational instruments, everything was frozen in time, creating a sense of invisible connection between us and the long-gone era. The air in the cabins was cold and still, and the flickering of our lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls, prompting the imagination to paint vivid pictures of the past. Hoarfrost covered every surface, giving the rooms the appearance of frozen time capsules. Reaching the last door, we discovered the captain's cabin. In the center of the room stood a writing desk, behind which sat a skeleton in the posture of someone busy writing. Approaching closer, we saw that a ship's log lay before him. Michael, acting cautiously, carefully extracted it from under the bony fingers. The log was written in Dutch, and Professor Hale, who was proficient in it, began to translate. Here is what was written there. June 23rd, 1884. Today we left port to explore the northern seas. Our journey began under favorable stars, and the crew is full of determination to uncover the mysteries hidden in the icy waters. July 2nd, 1884. We have veered off course. Unforeseen Arctic storms have carried us far north, into uncharted waters where sea and sky merge into one. Here, where ice rules, we find ourselves trapped, surrounded by ominous ice flows. July 15th, 1884. Our struggle with the ice continues. We attempt to break through the frozen barriers, but nature proves stronger. With each passing day, the situation becomes more desperate. July 28th, 1884. Sudden disappearances have begun. The first to vanish was a young sailor. Then a fog enveloped the area, and he returned, standing on the edge of the ice and silently watching the ship. When we tried to approach, he retreated into the fog. Through a spyglass, we saw that his eyes were lifeless. It was the most horrifying discovery. August 12th, 1884. The disappearances continue, and every night the missing return to stand on the ice and silently observe us. In these soulless eyes, there is not a hint of life. August 20th, 1884. One of our bravest sailors discovered something incredible not far from the ship. A giant creature resembling a squid, frozen in the ice. We concluded that it is this creature that is behind our woes. August 27th, 1884. The decision is made. We have begun to cleave the ice to reach the creature. The work is arduous, but the determination of the crew knows no bounds. We are almost there. August 28th, 1884. Tomorrow should be the decisive day. If all goes according to plan, we will destroy the creature and put an end to this nightmare. I hope the next entry will be about our... These were the last words left by the captain in the ship's log, the words trailing off as if death had come instantly. My companions and I exchanged frightened glances, trying to understand the events that had unfolded on this ship. Professor Hale, taking advantage of the moment of silence, suggested that we leave this place immediately. We all nodded in agreement, agreeing with his wise advice. However, when we found ourselves back on deck, Michael noticed a hatch that apparently led to the cargo hold. Despite our attempts to convince him not to take risks and to leave as soon as possible, he was adamant in his decision to continue searching, assuring us that he would do everything quickly and without any trouble. After a short time, his voice echoed from the depths of the ship, and we, overcoming our fear, followed the sound. In the cargo hold, an amazing sight awaited us. Michael stood next to one of the many crates scattered on the floor, and to his great joy, he discovered that it was full of gold. In the eyes of my companions, I saw the reflection of greed, while Michael did not hide his delight at such a find. We checked other crates, and each of them was also filled with gold. After a brief discussion, it was decided to transfer the gold to our ship. Although I too felt joy at such luck, deep down a sense of foreboding crept into my soul, urging me to flee as quickly as possible. But, as often happens, the voice of reason and the desire to possess the treasure prevailed over instinctual feelings of danger. When we returned to the sleds, we were met with a scene that filled our hearts with cold horror. All the dogs lay dead, their bodies mutilated as if attacked by some ferocious predator. Among the lifeless bodies of our faithful companions, we found the body of the watchman Will, torn apart with the same cruelty, suggesting an attack by a bear, although it was impossible to determine the exact cause of this tragedy. Amidst the chaos and destruction, I noticed the absence of Storm, the wolf. He was not among the dead. This circumstance remained a mystery, intensifying the atmosphere of anxiety and incomprehension. We were deeply saddened by the loss. With heavy hearts, we carried Will's body aboard the ship, where we buried him with honors. This event shrouded the expedition in a veil of sorrow and mourning. Following this tragedy, panic and superstition began to spread among the sailors. Whispers of an unholy force roaming the ice, of ancient Arctic guardians rising against intruders, filled the ship. Many began to see this ominous sign as a warning and a call to retreat, while others sought logical explanations for what had happened. At that time, sleep came to me with difficulty, and my soul was filled with worry and sadness over the loss of Will, with whom I was particularly close. His sudden death left a deep wound in my heart. Thoughts of what had happened filled every minute until suddenly I was awakened by a piercing scream. Rushing onto the deck, I was met with chaos. One of the sentries had disappeared without a trace. His partner, the only witness, shared with us the gruesome details. According to him, when everyone was already asleep, a fog thickened around the ship. However, this fog behaved strangely, as if deliberately avoiding approaching the ship, forming a kind of safe zone around it. During his watch, when the witness momentarily left, his partner disappeared. His return brought no signs of his presence. Despite a thorough search of the entire ship, the missing man was never found, which raised alarm. Listening to this account, those of us who had been on the doomed ship with horror realized that what was happening ominously echoed the descriptions from the ship's log. The same inexplicable phenomena, the same mystical fog, and mysterious disappearances. All of it indicated that we might have encountered the same unexplained threat that had destroyed the crew of the ship we found years ago. Despite the grim events, we found ourselves unable to leave the icy clutches into which fate had bound us. The captain, realizing the seriousness of the situation, ordered the work to free the ship to be accelerated. In addition, he formed a squad of 10 soldiers and decided to return to the ill-fated ship. The gold was too valuable a trophy to leave behind. Understanding that the risk of injury was high, I decided to join them as a medic. When we reached the ship, the weather was getting worse. The wind was picking up. Climbing onto its deck, I surveyed the surroundings. Besides the rustling of torn scraps of sails flapping in the wind, there was dead silence all around. We descended into the hold and began extracting the gold. Suddenly, my hearing caught a strange noise from a dark corner where something was lurking behind old barrels. One of the sailors noticed it and went to investigate the source of the sound. I wanted to warn him, but but then a huge, hairy creature leapt out of hiding and instantly attacked the sailor, killing him on the spot. Gunshots rang out as we opened fire on the monster. With incredible agility, it dodged bullets, attacking another crew member. Only after several volleys did we manage to wound the creature, which with a piercing howl rushed towards the exit. The sailors chased after it, while I stayed to administer first aid. One sailor was dead, but the life of the other could still be saved. I quickly bandaged his wounds, and soon the sailors returned. The monster had vanished. We stood, shaken by what had happened. The creature that attacked us resembled none of the known creatures. It resembled a humanoid wolf or some kind of chimera. To my horror, I recognized Storm in this monster. What unknown forces could have turned him into such a creature? The captain decided to leave the body of the deceased sailor behind and carefully load the wounded one onto a stretcher. Seizing the remaining crates of gold, we headed back to our ship, filled with a mixture of fear, horror, and bewilderment at what we had just experienced. Suddenly, a blizzard broke out on the way. The snowstorm began with such force that the way back was quickly covered, and soon we lost our bearings, straying off course. Surrounded by the whirl of snow, we continued moving forward, hoping to find our way back to the ship. It was at that moment, when our burden became unbearable, and fear gripped our hearts with a cold hand, that a creature burst out of the whirlwind like a ghost. With inhuman speed, it attacked us, carrying one of the soldiers into the abyss of the storm, leaving behind only a crate of gold, which spilled its shiny contents onto the pristine snow. Panic instantly seized us. Gunfire erupted, but the bullets disappeared into the snowy void, failing to hit their mark. Deciding to continue our journey, we were forced to abandon several crates of gold so that a few soldiers could guard us. It was a heavy but necessary decision, as each of us sought to survive in these incredibly harsh conditions. Soon we noticed an icy cliff ahead, towering majestically amidst the blizzard. Deciding that it was our chance for salvation, we headed towards it and found shelter behind its rugged walls. Here, in relative protection from the raging elements, we were able to catch our breath for a moment, trying to gather our strength and consider our next steps. When the storm and the snowy veil finally subsided, we cautiously emerged from our shelter and discovered that the elements had left us facing something unimaginably horrifying. Before us rose an icy cliff, within which, like in a sinister sarcophagus, was imprisoned a gigantic squid-like monster. Its frozen silhouette resembled the embodiment of fear itself, held captive in this Arctic block. Fresh tracks were visible around the cliff. It seemed that the creature was on the verge of breaking free from its icy prison. Filled with horror and realization of our own vulnerability, we hurried to retreat. However, before we could step back, the air was pierced by a piercing howl. Looking up, we saw at the top of the cliff a humanoid wolf, standing on its hind legs and emitting its terrifying cry into the sky. This vision was so shocking that, forgetting about the gold, we succumbed to the instinct of survival and fled, exhausted but determined to escape at any cost. The return to the Resolute was filled with anxiety and despair. Carrying the wounded on our shoulders, we barely approached the ship when Professor Hale came running towards us. Horror was reflected on his face, and his gaze was full of concern. We hurried to share our experiences, telling him about the encounter with the monster and the loss of our comrade. But the professor interrupted us, delivering even more alarming news. 5 more crew members had disappeared. This discovery pierced us with icy cold, intensifying our determination to leave this cursed place as soon as possible. Fortunately, the work to free the ship from its icy prison was nearing completion, and we had hope for a speedy departure. After laying the wounded in the sick bay and providing necessary assistance, I immediately joined those who were chopping ice, aiming to expedite our liberation. But then, from afar, a howl reached us, and soon we were surrounded by fog, as if it heralded new misfortunes. We redoubled our efforts, and finally, the Resolute managed to set sail. The sound of the departure signal made us rush onto the ship. At the last moment, glancing back at the fog, I saw that creature, standing amidst a multitude of figures. Among them were recently missing sailors and figures dressed in outdated maritime costumes, apparently victims of years past. The ship slowly moved away from the icy expanse, the ice cracking under its weight, the fog beginning to dissipate, and we finally left that place, full of mysteries and horrors behind. As we distanced ourselves from the shores shrouded in mystique and death, we realized that we were not returning home intact. Part of our crew was lost, and part was injured. Ahead of us awaited not only the familiar harbor, but also the necessity to explain the incredible events we had experienced. Doubts about whether we would be believed, for facing the impossible head-on, we could barely believe in the reality of what we had gone through ourselves, clouded our thoughts on the way home. It was Monday. I was sitting at my desk, reminiscing about the previous match of my favorite baseball team. At that moment, Nancy, my secretary, entered the office and informed me that we had a visitor. I was surprised, wondering who could have come so early in the morning. A minute later, a tall man in an expensive business suit entered my office, making a pleasant impression. I stood up to shake his hand, and he introduced himself as Harry Mitchell. Offering him a seat, I asked if he wanted coffee. He declined, preferring to get straight to the point. "What can I do for you?" I asked. Harry said, "I know you're involved in developing computational programs and selling equipment for that purpose. I want you to help me calculate the end of the world." I looked at him puzzled. Despite his decent appearance, his words seemed strange to me. He handed me documents with provided algorithms for computing 10,000 names of God. After a rough estimate, I realized it would be a significant order and quoted the amount to the client. He agreed without hesitation, specifying that he pays for speed. At that moment, I realized that finally these eccentrics brought a good order to our company, and I didn't care anymore whether it was a cult or something similar. I explained to the client how much time it would approximately take to develop the program and asked for a deposit. After agreeing on the details, we shook hands and he left. It took about a month to develop the program and prepare the equipment. One day, the chief engineer, Alex, called me and said that the equipment was packed and we could set off. I left the office and got into the cabin of a truck loaded with equipment. About an hour later, we arrived at the address left by Mr. Mitchell. Before us stood a vast estate, shrouded in an aura of luxury and nobility. The gates slowly swung open, letting us into a world where every stone and every tree spoke of the greatness and refinement of this place. The facade of the house was adorned with intricate relief, and in the garden sprawling in front of the estate, fountains rustled, adding coolness to the air. To our surprise, the territory of the estate was inhabited by monks dressed in pristine white robes, with shaven heads. Some of them meditated in the shade of ancient oaks, while others prayed or simply walked along the alleys, immersed in their thoughts. Approaching the building, we were greeted by Mr. Mitchell himself. We exchanged greetings, after which we proceeded to unload the equipment and transferred it to the designated room. I was intrigued by the purpose of all this enterprise. Mr. Mitchell shared his story. He had spent his life earning money, but one day decided to dedicate himself to the search for the meaning of life. His travels led him to the high mountains of Tibet, where he met the monks. The philosophy of life they shared radically changed his views on the world. He lived among them for 5 years, and one day learned that the monks were engaged in computations. According to their belief, humanity was created to compute the 10,000 names of God, and after this task is completed, the end of the world will come, as people will fulfill their purpose. He was inspired by the idea of these computations and began to help the monks. However, he soon realized that calculating all 10,000 names would take at least another 1,000 years. Therefore, he returned to the States and decided to seek the help of computers to accomplish this task. That's why he hired us. While my colleagues were setting up the equipment, I explained to Mr. Mitchell that the first 2,000 names would be computed in about a week. With each new name, the work would accelerate. The next 2,000 names would be ready in 3 days, then the next 2,000 in 2 days, and the remaining 2,000 names would be computed just 5 hours after the previous 8,000. Mr. Mitchell thanked me for the work done and explained that as each set of 2,000 names is computed, global events will occur according to the beliefs of the monks. According to tradition, when the first 2,000 names are computed, an invasion of insects will occur. At the stage of 4,000 names, birds and other flying creatures will fall to the ground. Upon reaching 6,000 names, the seas will turn red from blood. When all 10,000 names are computed, natural disasters will begin, and the end of the world will come. I was struck by the precision of the monks' predictions, to which Mr. Mitchell remarked that the monks are always accurate in their calculations. Soon, the workers finished installing the equipment and setting up the program, which immediately started working. After bidding farewell to Mr. Mitchell and receiving payment for the work done, I happily returned to the office. On the way, I discussed the events with Alex, who was also aware of all the details told by this unusual wealthy man. "What do you think, sir? How truthful are these legends?" I asked. "It's all nonsense," Alex replied. "There's no point in filling your head with such stories of sectarians and crazies waiting for the end of the world. At the end of the 20th century, there were plenty of such people, and what? We're all alive. Nothing happened." That's where our conversation ended, but in our firm, rumors of the order began to circulate. I paid no attention to them, but soon everything changed. The week passed unnoticed. I was at home, spending time in the garden, playing with my son, David. I had recently bought him a toy bus, with which he happily drove around the garden, ferrying his toys. Suddenly he ran up to me and started pulling on my sleeve. Turning around to find out what he wanted, I heard his complaint. "Daddy, I can't transport all these passengers. There are too many of them." At first, I was ready to dismiss it as another child's fantasy, but he persistently pulled on my sleeve and pointed at something in the garden. Getting up, I decided to see what he was pointing at. Walking through the garden, adorned with lawns and trees, I saw his child's toy bus lying on the grass. The bus was covered in ants, crawling all over it from inside and outside. I became worried, grabbed David, and stepped back, noticing that ants had overrun my entire garden. Soon, my wife's cry came from the kitchen. Grabbing the child, I ran to her and saw her standing on a chair, pointing at something behind the cupboard. There was a horde of cockroaches. I helped her get down and we immediately left the house. I called the disinfection service, but no one answered. Not knowing what to do next, I put my family in the car and we headed to the office. Arriving there, I found that my employees had also gathered there looking worried. They told me that insect invasions had occurred in their homes too. Turning on the news, we learned about the strange activity of insects throughout the city. Then Alex asked me, "Sir, could this be related to that project? The timing coincides with the computation of the first 2,000 names." I brushed him off, saying it was just a coincidence, and such a thing couldn't happen. The next day, all the insects suddenly disappeared, and we were able to return home. Although I convinced my employees that everything that happened was just nonsense, I myself felt a slight unease. Rumors spread throughout the city. People were worried, as such things had never happened before. However, with time, the urban unrest subsided, and life gradually returned to normal. In 2 days, the next 4,000 names were supposed to be computed. These days came, and I, somewhat calmed down, still wondered if the second prediction would come true. According to the legend, birds were supposed to fall from the sky, but it didn't happen. On that day, I planned to attend the match of my favorite baseball team together with my wife and son. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we headed to the stadium, where a huge crowd had gathered. After passing through the line and purchasing drinks and snacks, my family and I eagerly took our seats. The game began, and we enthusiastically cheered for our team when suddenly an incident occurred. One of the players was preparing to hit the ball when a bird fell from the sky, landing right under his bat. Shards, blood, and flesh scattered towards the stands, causing shock among the spectators. Soon, the cawing of crows flying over the stadium was heard, and birds began to crash onto the field and stands. Only silence remained from the loud stadium, interrupted only by the thud of falling birds. Panic suddenly ensued, and people began to leave their seats in horror. Not succumbing to panic, I hugged my family and stayed seated. When the stadium emptied, those who remained, not succumbing to the general fear, looked around puzzled. I took out my smartphone and turned on the news, where the host reported with alarm about the death of birds worldwide. At that moment, engineer Alex called me with a message. "Boss, the situation is starting to take a worrying turn." I assured him that I would return to the office soon, after which I took my family home and headed to meet Alex and other employees to discuss our next steps. When I returned to the office, I was greeted by Alex and a group of concerned employees. They were all aware of the details of our order but could not discuss it with others due to the signed confidentiality agreement. Violating this agreement threatened us with hefty fines. I discussed the situation with the team. It was difficult for all of us to believe that the first 2 predictions had come true, and our reality began to change gradually. Deciding to act, I called Mr. Mitchell, who answered the call immediately. "I'm listening," Mr. Mitchell said. "Your predictions have started to come true, and we and the employees are worried. Even I was a little scared," I admitted. "Oh yes, you and your employees have done well. Everything is going according to plan. In a couple of days, we should reach the 6,000 mark," he gratefully noted. "But if everything continues like this, the world is facing its end," I said with concern. "Of course, that's how it was intended," he replied unequivocally. I thought to myself that I was dealing with a real madman and asked, "Could you stop your calculations?" "It's simply impossible," he replied and hung up. Turning to the bewildered employees, I contemplated our next steps. We couldn't stop the computer's work because it was programmed to operate autonomously. It was also impossible to tell others about what was happening due to the confidentiality agreement. In this situation, I decided to reassure my employees by suggesting that we wait a couple more days and see what happens next. The employees, although concerned, dispersed to their tasks. Attempts to call again were unsuccessful. No one answered the phone. All that was left was to wait and hope. 2 days passed in anxious anticipation. Finally, the day came when the 6,000 mark was supposed to be reached. All the employees gathered in the office, turned on the news, and work seemed to come to a halt. We were all too excited to think about anything else. By 10 o'clock in the morning, there were no news reports. Silence persisted even at 11 o'clock. Tension filled the office by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. When 4 o'clock came and went without anything happening, some employees began to sigh with relief, but I felt it was too early to rejoice. Suddenly, the news anchor interrupted the broadcast with an urgent message. The U.S. coast had turned red due to an invasion of red algae. Scientists were puzzled and could not understand the cause of the phenomenon, speculating a connection to global warming. We were stunned and didn't know what to do next. Deciding to take a risk and violate the confidentiality agreement, we invited journalists. Initially, they were skeptical of our words, but they agreed to cover the story nonetheless. I told them everything I knew in front of the camera and waited for the results, understanding that we couldn't do anything more. The next day, upon arriving at the office, I found a huge crowd of people in front of it. Seeing me, they began to shout, and noticing their frightened faces, I realized that many had believed my words. They demanded Mr. Mitchell's residential address, to which Alex, stepping outside, loudly announced it. All of this was being recorded on camera, and the enraged crowd, reacting excitedly, headed towards the estate. The police stayed on the sidelines, not intervening. Entering the office, I turned on the news and saw a report about how the crowd surrounded the residence, unable to penetrate inside due to armed guards. Looking out the window, I noticed that people continued to flock to our office. By noon, their number had noticeably increased. I summoned Alex, and we were about to head to the residence when a powerful earthquake with a magnitude of about 8 struck. Everything around was shaking, but fortunately the building held up. After the calm, I looked out the window again and saw people falling to the ground and some buildings collapsing in the city. Turning on the news, I learned that the earthquake had occurred throughout the state. Alex looked at me bewildered and frightened. We realized it was time to act. Rushing outside, we saw the policemen in shock. One of them asked where we were going and offered to drive us to the residence. With the sirens blaring, we drove there, followed by a huge crowd. Upon arrival, we found a massive crowd already there, storming the fence and gates. The guards began to shoot, and in response, the police opened fire. I realized that everyone had indeed believed what was happening. As the next prediction was only 5 hours away, the situation intensified. Armed men continued to resist, helicopters flew in, and the National Guard arrived. Suddenly, soldiers took me and led me to the general. He listened to me and then said that all my words were nonsense. But when nonsense starts to come true, it becomes the truth. He gave the order, and soldiers quickly pushed back the crowd, after which the assault began. The guards continued to shoot, but the resistance couldn't last long, and soon the residence was captured. And I, along with the general, entered the premises. To our horror, the bunker was impregnable. Sappers tried to blow up the door, but nothing happened. Everyone was in a panic, and I looked at the doomed eyes of the people around me. There were only 10 minutes left until X moment. Someone suggested blowing up the bunker with a nuclear bomb. There were 5 minutes left on the clock until the appointed time. People started to run away as if they thought they could escape. When there was only 1 minute left, I resigned myself to the inevitable. But suddenly the door opened, and Mr. Mitchell came out to us. Many weapons were aimed at him, but he joyfully shouted, "Finally, it's done!" A group of soldiers burst into the room, but he turned around and said, "It's too late. 10,000 names have finally been counted." We were in shock, wondering what would happen next. At that moment, Meister Mitchell stood there and laughed madly. Suddenly, one of the soldiers screamed in horror and pointed upwards. We raised our heads and saw a clear, starry sky. I sat on the ground in horror because the stars in the sky were fading one by one, as if someone was gradually turning off the lights in the universe.